The words from the police officer weren't a request. They carried a sharpness, a finality that felt more like an accusation than a question. He had already made up his mind. A black man driving a luxury car in a white neighborhood didn't belong. What Officer Rick Delroy didn't know was that the man behind the wheel was none other than Franklin O. Gaines, a retired Supreme Court justice, a man who had spent his life interpreting and upholding the very laws Rick now twisted in his favor. Franklin had only wanted to visit his late wife's resting place, placing white gardenias on her grave like he did every Sunday. He drove a matte black Lincoln, polished but aged, like him, timeless in its grace. His hat was tilted just right, his vest neatly buttoned. Dignity wasn't something he wore, it radiated from within him. Rick, parked near the cemetery gate, eyed Franklin suspiciously as he drove by. In his mind, an elderly black man in such a car couldn't have earned it. He must have stolen it, borrowed it, or worse. Without hesitation, Rick turned on his flashing lights and pulled Franklin over. Franklin responded with calm and courtesy. "Is there a problem, officer?" Rick leaned toward the window. "License and registration. Do you know why I pulled you over?" "I assume you have a reason. Otherwise, this would be harassment," Franklin said, his tone polite but firm. Rick bristled. "Step out of the car." Franklin raised an eyebrow but complied without protest. He handed Rick his ID, aged with a silver seal that had faded over time. Rick squinted at it and smirked. "Looks fake." "If you believe it is, I suggest you report it," Franklin replied evenly. Rick's irritation grew. "Pop the trunk." "Under what suspicion?" Franklin asked, still calm. Rick couldn't give a clear answer, because there wasn't one. But Franklin walked to the back and opened it anyway. Inside were white flowers, a folded blanket, a small wooden box with an engraving, and an old photo of a woman, his wife. No weapons, no stolen goods, just the things that matter to a man whose world once made sense, Franklin said quietly. Rick stared, momentarily speechless. The man hadn't just complied. He had exposed the hollowness of Rick's assumptions. A woman nearby slowed her car and rolled down her window. "Oh my God." "That's Franklin Gaines," she whispered. "He used to speak at my college. He's a judge, a great one." Rick looked again at the man he'd just treated like a suspect. Then a boy walked by, filming with his phone. "What are you filming?" Rick snapped. "I'm filming dignity," the boy answered softly. Franklin put the flowers back in the trunk and looked at Rick one last time. "I used to believe that the badge represented justice. I spent my life believing that. Today, you reminded me it still has a long way to go." Rick's voice cracked, the weight of his mistake setting in. "Sir, would you like an escort to the cemetery?" Franklin smiled faintly. "The path I walk has never needed an escort, officer. Just fewer obstacles." And with that, he drove away, slow and steady, the Lincoln blending into the golden afternoon light. Rick stood by the roadside, watching the taillights fade. He returned to his car and, with shaking fingers, typed the name into his phone. Franklin O. Gaines. Dozens of articles appeared. Scholar, author, Supreme Court Justice, Civil Rights Advocate, Defender of the Constitution. Rick's heart sank. In trying to assert power, he had tried to diminish greatness, but Franklin's dignity had remained intact, while Rick's assumptions shattered. Sometimes a uniform can blind you to the truth, but sometimes it takes a man like Franklin Gaines to help you see again. In 1998, Franklin Gaines chaired the Subcommittee for Federal Civil Procedure Reform. He turned down 3 nominations to the Senate in order to remain a state judge. One woman, in a barely audible voice, once said, "He never needed fame. He just needed not to be misunderstood." His name, Gaines, was at the center of every headline, every emergency meeting. Yet, he remained silent. When asked directly about the incident, He gave only a simple reply to a secretary. If I need to explain why I stay silent, then perhaps I've already said too much. The Federal Law Review later published a special article titled Franklin Gaines and the Cases That Never Made the Headlines, listing 14 critical rulings he had shaped. What stood out most wasn't the number of legal victories, but the complete absence of press conferences or victory speeches. No self-promotion, no spotlight, just service. Rick, the officer now under scrutiny, read that article, every word like a scalpel slicing through his long-held ideals of justice. On a televised roundtable, a veteran journalist remarked, "This isn't just a personal mistake. This is society being forced to face a question it's avoided too long. If a man like Gaines can be detained, how far have we strayed from our foundations?" An independent oversight board reviewed Rick Delroy's internal file. The findings were deeply troubling. His hastily written traffic stops lacked body cam footage, and radio communications during those stops were suspiciously interrupted. A local newspaper ran an investigative piece titled High Detection Rate or High Bias Rate, Zrenia. It revealed that Rick had stopped people of color at a rate 3.4 times higher than the department average, yet the actual infraction rate was significantly lower. Leaked internal emails showed that Rick's superiors were aware of his patterns, but never intervened. The hashtag #administrative accomplice went viral across social media. A 2021 memo warning about Delroy's behavior had been ignored. The former head of the legal department explained, "I thought someone else would handle it." That phrase, so casual, so damning, became the final judgment on the system itself. A survey later revealed that 72% of employees admitted to either witnessing or suspecting misconduct, but had chosen to remain silent. The focus shifted away from Rick and landed squarely on the system that created and protected someone like him. At a special state legislative hearing on law enforcement reform, Franklin Gaines entered quietly, unnoticed. He sat 5 rows from the back, near the emergency exit. No one introduced him, but somehow his presence changed the entire atmosphere of the room. A young legislator spoke. "I know someone in this room today, someone whose words made my father keep studying law just because of a sentence he overheard once." Another legislator added, "I was once a legal secretary in Judge Gaines's office. He taught me how to lose without losing honor." Gaines said nothing for the entire 3-hour session. He simply took notes. When the session ended, he stood up, closed his notebook, and left quietly. But the chairperson of the session paused and said to everyone in the room, "Someone sat in the back today and made this room, for the first time in a long time, reflect." Elsewhere, Rick Delroy sat in a small recording studio. No media handlers, no audience, just him, preparing to confess. "I used to think I was doing the right thing," Rick began, his voice low, eyes avoiding the camera. "I followed procedure, I used the language I was trained to use, but then I realized there are moments when not letting your emotions interfere is exactly the problem, because emotions, they help you see someone as human, and I didn't." For the first time, he looked directly into the camera. "I stopped him because I couldn't reconcile the man with the car, the face with the way he calmly watched the road. His calm didn't match the unspoken expectations I was trained to question." He paused. "I didn't yell, I didn't threaten, I didn't use force, but I placed him in a situation I would never place myself in, and that's what's terrifying." He didn't ask for forgiveness. "I just hope," he said slowly, "that those who enter this profession after me don't think they can act without empathy and still call it justice." The video, raw and unedited, lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. It was soon requested in its original form by over a dozen law schools and police academies for educational use. After Rick's confession, change began quietly. In Tennessee, a teacher mispronounced a black student's name. No one laughed this time. The boy simply bowed his head and wrote in his notebook, "I am not your mispronunciation." In Oregon, tiny plastic fedora hats began appearing on license plates, an odd but symbolic tribute. In a Nebraska courtroom, a clerk asked softly, "How would you like me to pronounce your name correctly?" Meanwhile, Rick was dealing with the consequences in his own home. His son asked for time off school. "I don't want to be in class with the name everyone's talking about." At the dinner table, the child's civics notebook lay open. A handwritten passage stood out. What would you do if the person who once made you feel safe made others feel afraid? The boy looked at his father. "Dad always said a good person doesn't make others afraid." Then came the harder question. So why did that man have to stand like that in front of your car? It was a question not found in any training manual, and Rick no longer had the integrity once reflected in his son's eyes to answer it. At a national conference marking 30 years of legal and judicial reform in the United States, Franklin Gaines returned to the podium after months of silence, no speech in hand. His voice didn't boom. He simply lifted his head, scanned the room, and asked one question. At this point, who among you still believes I didn't know? It was a question that didn't seek an answer. It was meant to linger, long enough that future decisions could no longer hide behind organized ignorance. Gaines didn't wait for applause. He stepped down and walked away. After that day, his name disappeared from newspapers and talk shows, but his presence remained. In a police department in Wisconsin, the description field on traffic tickets was replaced with one new line. Did the individual feel discriminated against? A university in North Carolina honored his request by not hanging his portrait. Don't frame a person if what they leave behind is a way for others to remove their own frames, he had written. Instead, the school installed a whiteboard where students could write what they had relearned. Gaines-style questions, ethical dilemmas that went beyond procedure, began appearing on civil service exams. And in an elementary school in Illinois, the civics class opened with a question from a child. If someone made the world more fair just by watching, why don't we all try that too?